A review of the use of internal exclusion at Cantonian High School. Internal exclusion, like debates over exam difficulty or uniform policies, has captured the hearts and mind of stakeholders in education across the country. As a result, people, whether they have a close affiliation to a school or not, have developed opinions on the suitability and efficacy of internal exclusion as a behaviour management policy in schools. This PowerPoint presentation outlines research concerning the use and development of internal exclusion provisions. The research can be split into two categories: internal exclusion literature and school policy literature. My method of search for internal exclusion literature was to use Google Scholar. My motivation behind this was purely familiarity, as what I've used through all of my university studies. I selected a combination of keywords to search: children, isolation, effects, education. I then vetted each article by reading their abstract, and after successfully finding suitable articles, I'd follow an academic paper trail, noting down any references which were repeatedly mentioned in attempt to deepen my literature. Finally, I wanted to capture some of the non-academic public opinion that has been fueling the intense debate on internal exclusion. To do this, I just searched internal exclusion schools and isolation schools into Google News, Test Community and the eTeach community. For school policy literature, we were lucky enough as part of the course to have an extensive reading list, and I made this the basis of my research. I didn't just read these all without vetting though. Again, I read abstracts and I would follow the paper trail to try and deepen my reading. Research question 1. What are the arguments against schools' use of internal exclusion? Now, before we start looking at this, I think it's important to define what internal exclusion is. I want to make it clear that I follow Holmes 2009, who defines internal exclusion to be the separation of a pupil from their peers temporarily due to their behaviour. But this is the only criteria I set. I place no time constraints on this. I place no criteria for an individual's placement, and I don't set any criteria for what that provision should look like. I've gone for a thematic approach of what are the arguments against a school's use of internal exclusion. Theme 1 is that it negatively affects a child's mental health. Now, an article written by the campaign group No Isolation states that human interaction is a basic human need. I think many of us are seeing during these difficult times the negative effects of not being able to see friends and family. When we're isolated from people, our body perceives it as danger. We release stress hormones. Now, due to the effects that these stress hormones can have, Labelle et al. Argue that isolation is a form of corporal punishment because it leads to lower educational attainment, higher instances of psychological distress, and the increased likelihood in the future of being in a lower social class. Theme number 2 is that it doesn't solve the behaviour issue. Now, a large proportion of the literature opposes the use of isolation based on its lack of efficacy. Both Jones and Timbers and Louis Selly's studies argue that isolation serves as a means of controlling rather than improving behaviour. In an interview with eTeach, anti-booth campaigner Paul Dix argues that isolation is never the best option. Instead, Dix argues that being removed to a booth room for days or weeks is a cruel and unusual punishment. And rather than be isolated from their peers, children should be given a chance to talk to adults and sort the situation out there and then. Craig and Sanders 2018 call for a similar culture shift in schools, supporting the use of flexible approaches that are driven by kindness and respect, rather than placing children in situations where no peaceful resolution can be found. Theme 3 turns to it descales teachers. In an article for TESS, Dave Speck argues that isolation means that teachers have no ownership for instances of poor behaviour, and that the ability to call for a member of SLT to remove a child means that that child is now no longer a problem for the teacher. Due to this, teachers are missing out on viable opportunities to develop skills in being able to deal with the instance in the moment and speak to parents and the child post poor behaviour. Finally, is that it's unmonitored. Now, internal exclusion is seen in many different guises across schools in the UK. And a blog post on TES by Sarah Dan highlights the difference. She reflected on her time in 3 schools which all had completely different provisions. Now, the lack of regulation was highlighted by the attack on Outward Grange Academy's Trust's internal exclusion practices by lawyers. This legal action shone light on the fact that, unlike external exclusions or permanent exclusions, there is no legal guidance for schools to follow when putting internal exclusion provisions in place, which means that schools do not know exactly how to design a provision that best suits their learners. Research question 2. What are the arguments for schools' use of internal exclusion? Once again, I've gone for a thematic approach to this. Now, theme 1, the other 29 pupils. By the other 29 pupils, this could be any class size, but I'm drawing importance to the needs of every pupil in that classroom at the same time. A lot of support for this argument has come from the extensive TES community. An example being Bessie Smith's argument that the education of other pupils in the room needs to be considered. When a disruptive pupil sits in a classroom, it makes it difficult to deliver a high quality lesson. In a similar community thread, a mother places a different perspective on the issue of internal exclusion. She states that while teachers may teach a class with a difficult pupil in, say, 4 or 5 hours a week, pupils in that class are expected to put up with the poor behaviour for all of their lessons during that week. And the quiet, nice kids are often ignored due to their compliant nature, which means that those behaving the worst get the most attention. Theme 2, punishment is being demonised. Now, the rather dramatic phrase of demonising was coined by Teaching Battleground. The key point behind this message is that any form of punishment in schools is being demonised and abhorred. In a blog post on TES, Slovenia highlights this growing attitude, stating that in 20 years' time people will perceive the use of internal exclusion to be equally barbaric to the cane. Tom Bennett, a widely renowned behaviour advisor to the government, disagrees with these attitudes, arguing that internal exclusion can be a perfectly normal, useful and compassionate strategy. Perhaps due to the nature of internal exclusion policies being so widespread and so different, and so many people opposing them, stakeholders have neglected to search for success stories of where internal exclusion is being used effectively. To return to the blog post of Sarah Dan and her experiences in different schools, her favoured form of internal exclusion policy included specific numeracy and literacy interventions, something they had identified in her school to be a cause of poor behaviour, and the opportunity to speak to a counsellor. In this case, it is hard to demonise this form of intervention and draw parallels to the cane. Research question 3. How do schools develop and monitor school-wide initiatives? This section focuses heavily on the Education Endowment Foundation's publication, Putting Evidence to Work, a School's Guide to Implementation. Their document outlines a 4-step cyclic process that can take up to 2 or 3 years that can be used by schools to implement new interventions. The 4 steps are explore, prepare, deliver and sustain. I will look through each of these 4 steps and make note of where other research complements or disagrees with their works. So step 1, explore. In this stage, a school should clearly define a problem it wants to solve and identify some potential interventions to do this. Now, 3 important steps are key to this. The first thing that you need to do is identify a key priority that is amenable to change. Now, the authors state here that instinct is often the driver of this first step, and this needs to be done collaboratively but slowly. Now, the reason for saying this is slowly is explained by Kearney and Kwiatkowski, that state that problems identified in the past often come automatically and inescapably to mind, meaning they cloud your judgment and focus on the wrong things. 2. Systematically explore programs or practices to implement. Schools need to engage with real-world policy making and actively search for solutions rather than hoping for one to emerge. However, McLeavy 2015 states that you need to be hesitant when comparing research in other schools and hoping that you will achieve the same result. He says that on the surface, all education interventions can appear to work everywhere, but also nowhere. Finally, and this is most important, examine the fit and feasibility within the school. Look inward, explore your own context, and then use this to advise on what research is applicable. The second major stage is to prepare. The first thing that needs to be done is develop a clear and logical plan. This stage is crucial to the successful implementation of the intervention. The Behavioural Insights team state that this should be heavily driven by what school leaders want the intervention to achieve. However, the minutiae of the plan should be done collaboratively. 2. Assess the readiness of the school. Hallinger and Heck define readiness to be the school's capacity to improve. However, the capacity for school improvement fluctuates through the year, and leaders should take advantage of what Kearney and Kwiatkowski term windows of improvement. Finally, make steps to prepare staff practically. Train them, develop infrastructure, involve outside partners, and during this step, simplify the intervention. Make sure that the teacher's perception is that it's convenient, easy, and will achieve results. The first major step in the delivery then, and it's called deliver. First stage is to support staff and be flexible. The Education Endowment Foundation comments that a common challenge is ensuring that an intervention is being implemented correctly. So support staff to do that. Staff often tend to like certain parts of a policy more than others, leading to a temptation for teachers to cherry pick their favourite elements. Whilst at an individual level this may seem okay, if every person in the school were to do this, it detracts from an intervention's efficacy and measurability. Second thing, reinforce that training. Like the prepare stage, the role of leadership is to build and shape that school's capacity for improvement. Give teachers all of the tools they need to be successful. Finally, gather data. Now, the Behavioural Insights team state that interventions need to be reliably measured, but it's important to note Hirsch 2002's opinion that this is notoriously hard. Educational research is fraught with noise that makes it near impossible to tease out relative contributions of the different factors leading to statistically significant results. Finally, sustain. Now, if the insights gained from the analysis of data indicate successful results, leaders now need to plan for the long-term sustainability. Most importantly, however, teachers need to be ready to adapt their strategies to the changing conditions. Secondly, highlight good practice. Attention needs to be attracted to those who are operating with utmost compliance to the new policy, and rewards need to be designed that encourage further adoption. Once a large proportion of the staff are compliant, it must be made clear that the majority of staff are doing the right thing. And finally, treat the scale-up as a new process. Whether the time over which the intervention is now being put in place or the scope in terms of pupil numbers is increased, it is important that new compliance and engagement within the school leads to teachers making a commitment to each other for long-term success. Thank you for listening. I'm just going to show you my bibliography. Bibliography page 1, page 2, page 3, and page 4. Thank you very much.